This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
I love our new jaunty little jingle-jangle thing at the start there.
Super great, super great.
It's fabulous. Hey, welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, shouting out about anything and everything from the worlds of arts, sciences and mataranga Māori. Brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. I'm Dr Barb.
And I'm Trudy.
And today we have the amazing, now it's Associate Professor, isn't it? Associate Professor Michael Knapp in the studio with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we are talking about, what are we talking about? New Zealand birds, basically, where they came from, where they're going, what's the whole of New Zealand birds, right, from the very beginnings to as far into the future as we can see.
Exactly, birds and everything you never wanted to know about them.
Birds and everything you never wanted to know, but specifically New Zealand birds.
Yes.
But are they truly New Zealand birds?
Are they truly New Zealand birds? What's special about New Zealand birds there, Michael? I detected an accent there, so something's obviously drawn you to these beautiful shores. Was it the New Zealand birds?
Let's stick with that story. It wasn't exactly, but they contributed significantly. And yes, are they really New Zealand birds, or are they from somewhere else? Or when do you call them New Zealand birds?
Oh, right. Yeah, no, that's all. In some ways, it's semantics, and it sort of doesn't really matter, I guess. But then in other ways, I guess it's actually really quite important because different species have different legal status, and it goes down to all those conservation issues and priorities about what we're doing to help those birds or just not interfere with them, and where and how we do that sort of conservation work, I guess, as well.
And also our birds are part of our national identity, and perhaps we might need to broaden or change how we think about who are our national birds. Like, imagine if the New Zealand Bird of the Year got won by an Australian. That would be devastating.
Shocking, wouldn't it? Devastating almost. Yeah. we might cycle back to that. Now, you're not actually a conservation ecologist, though. You're a molecular ecologist, I've got written here.
Yeah, so my history is somewhat complicated. I'm an ecologist by training, and a geographer by training, and a plant biologist by training, and now I'm working on animals, which makes me a zoologist by training as well. But
I guess all of those things really are encompassed within ecology, aren't they?
They are, and so perhaps I'm very much an ecologist in the sense that I work on pretty much everything that's alive, and I wonder how it works together. My job description specifically is probably, twofold. It's molecular ecologist for very much describing the research I'm doing, and it's also biological anthropologist, which describes a lot of the teaching I'm doing, and those two things actually they reach into each other as well.
So when I think of an anthropologist, I tend to think of a people person, like people who are studying how human culture either evolved or is or somewhere in culture. But how does that fit in with you studying birds?
See, the thing is that people don't exist in a bubble. They interact with their environment, and that's what I'm really interested in.
Right.
I want to know, how are birds and other animals and plants affected by people? How are people affected by the environment? How do they influence the environment? How does the environment influence them? And that's this intersection. That's where a lot of my research sits. But it does spread into purely zoology in many questions as well.
Yeah. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? And that really is when I think of ecology, I think of kind of interactions between species and other species, and those species with the environment where they are, and people are part of that, I guess. And then the distinction between that and geography, gosh, I'm not really sure. It's just more about space than ecology quite often. It's kind of a little bit more and I guess more about people interactions as well, geography. But your original diploma is a diploma geographer from, now am I going to say this right, Saarbrücken in Germany.
Yes, that's
and
correct.
then you did a PhD in plant biology at the University of Massey. What brought you to New Zealand, to the University of Massey?
I was when I was still studying in Saarbrücken, we did a field trip to New Zealand, which I found extremely fascinating, and I at that point, I wasn't particularly focused on a specific topic other than something biological.
Right.
I just looked for a way to get to New Zealand.
Wow.
As a result of that very fascinating trip, and it turned out that a project offered itself, which was neatly following on from some studies I had done in Saarbrücken still, biogeographic studies.
Right.
And so I was fortunate enough to be offered that project and a scholarship for it, and that's what
Wow.
brought me here the first time.
The first time.
I
And
now
then
moved to
obviously
New
you're
Zealand
back
3
here
times.
at the University of Otago now in the School of Biomedical School, is it?
Yes, it is. The
So
School of
it's the
Biomedical
anatomy
Sciences.
department
It
in the
is.
biomedical
Yes.
school.
Yeah.
Because
That's a bit odd.
it doesn't sort of quite fit there.
No.
does it? So I guess the anatomy is, as a subject, is not just human anatomy, right? It's anatomy, or is it? I'm struggling again.
So
is it?
this is the Department of Anatomy is a lot broader than just pure anatomy, and that's a historical thing. It actually diversified some time ago and long before I was here. The way I got into it was with work on human migration in the Pacific.
Right.
And this is still a subject that some of my research reaches into.
Right.
But a lot of my research is also on birds.
But of course, when humans migrate, they tend to take with them a whole lot of other things, including their domesticated species.
And they
that
affect the environment where they arrive, and that's exactly
and that,
where I'm-
the
that
environment
obviously affects
affects
the species that are
Yeah.
there when they arrive. Do they ever? No, they never affect this. They never affect the environment when they leave because they never completely leave, do they? It seems like we're
There's
shifting
7
on. but
billion
we-
of us still here. Thank you.
Yeah, no. Well, it's sort of we don't ever really leave a place, do we? We just sort of send offshoots on.
Easter Island or whatever
Oh,
it is now.
that's true. Yeah, no, Easter
And,
Island. There's a few. There's a few islands around the edges of the UK as well. I think that have had people leave, and maybe through Greek islands. Yeah, there's a couple of them. Maybe. Yeah. All right, I stand corrected. Yeah, there are a few places that humans have been and then left.
Not many.
It's a point to Trudy, that one. Hey, so Saarbrücken, Germany, and then a PhD in plant biology here, and then Otago University, and you're a Rutherford Discovery Fellow as well.
And that wasn't even all steps. I actually went back to Germany after my PhD to do some work at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology there. And then I came back to
So that's how
Otago.
you really got into molecular stuff?
No, that was during my PhD.
Oh, that was during your PhD.
Yeah. And then the zoology part came in at the Max Planck Institute.
Right, yeah.
But
lost
that was
to
always
the dark side, that's what us botanists
well,
say.
I was lost even during working on my plant PhD. In fact, one of my lecturers, undergraduate lecturers, when he heard that I was doing a PhD in plant biology, he said he would have bet his house that I was going to do something zoological. So I was off the rails
Off the
temporarily.
rails, yeah. And you haven't come back to plant biology?
I have.
You have? Oh,
Yeah,
good,
yeah.
You can't stay in that dark zone of zoology forever.
I'm equal opportunity.
Equal opportunity.
ecologist now.
Nice balanced ecologist there. Right. Excellent. I've lost my train of thought of where I was going to go there. So at the moment, what you're working on is, I saw you've got a really nice blog post there, and that's through the Science Media Centre, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's quite fantastic.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity and a way to communicate some of the research. And I always feel that research that you don't communicate or that you express in a way that is too complicated to understand, it's not worth it, right? You're doing research so that you provide, you create new knowledge, and you want to make sure that new knowledge is accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
And a blog is a very nice way to do that.
Yeah.
And that one blog is summarizing some of the quite a few papers really that we did in this space.
Yeah, no, I always sort of think if people can't explain or articulate their research in a way that other people can understand who aren't in that particular field, then they don't possibly quite understand it well enough. I think they should go back and think about it a bit more. I have several lecturers in my past who probably didn't agree with that sentiment. But I think it is a different skill being able to express what your research is doing to people who aren't in that field. But I do think it's a very important skill that is part of publicly funded research. I mean, fair enough, if you're a multimillionaire and you're just doing your own thing, then fine, just do your own thing. But we hope that there's not that many Lex Luthors around. So anyway.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I have that skill, but it's certainly something I aspire to. So we can test
it out.
this.
Let's test it out. This is the theory. So we'll just go. We've got the link to this blog post on the Facebook page, and I think I put it in the episode description as well. Anyway, so it's all there, so people can read through it. But
hold on, we should say what it's called, so people know what they're looking for.
Sorry, Trudy, I'll let you go.
It's titled Noah's Ark or Flypaper of the Pacific: New Zealand's Place in the Biology of the Pacific. And I have to admit, I did take a bit of umbrage. It's been called the Flypaper of the Pacific.
It's quite a long title as well.
Yes. So there goes my skill in communicating, I guess.
Yeah. So what is it? Noah's Ark. That's obviously a reference to the moa.
This is referring to two great researchers who have done work in the origin of New Zealand fauna and flora. Noah's Ark, David Bellamy in early 1990, I think a botanist, he called it Noah's Ark in reference to this idea then that New Zealand was isolated and had been isolated since the age of the dinosaurs, basically, so that it was once attached to this great southern landmass, Gondwana, then rafted away like an ark with moa and everything else on it already. And so every New Zealand native species we find in New Zealand today would then be a relic from the age of the dinosaurs. It had been there since it rafted away. That's Noah's Ark.
Yeah, and amongst other things, that's been that David Bellamy has said in the recent past, that's been shown to be not entirely the whole story.
Yes, yeah. At the time, I think that was very much what the data suggested, but more data is now suggesting that it's perhaps not the entire story. And in fact, more and more data shows that a lot of species that we assumed had been here since 80 million years ago have arrived much later, much after New Zealand isolated. And in fact, at some stage it became so much that other researchers, Matt McLone in that particular case, suggested, well, perhaps it's not, perhaps everything here has arrived from somewhere else entirely.
And nothing was here. So that's kind of the submerged thesis where the whole of New Zealand all went underwater and nothing could possibly have survived that, but it's all kind of oldish looking because it's got here from nearby places which are have those more ancient lineages. Yeah. So where do we fall? Is that what's referred to by the fly paper?
That's the flypaper of the Pacific. So it's instead of being an ark, it's collected everything that's flying around the Pacific and
and just sort of stuck to this tiny little bit of land in the middle of the water.
Exactly.
So it's those two kind of opposite points. Either it's a Noah's Ark, it's all ancient, or it's a flypaper and it's all new and it's just kind of floated here or flown here or got blown here by some description from somewhere close by. And I guess those close by places are the Pacific, Australia.
Yeah. Australia is a hot candidate
South
for
America,
pretty much everything.
I mean, that's the way the wind blows, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
You got to get things from the way the wind blows.
Yeah.
And then I guess there's some things that go up high and
there is certainly stuff that came from elsewhere, but a lot of what we have here seems to be Australian.
So I'm hearing there a little bit that you might be not entirely convinced by the Noah's Ark idea, but are you entirely convinced by the flycatcher paper?
No,
what is it called?
Flypaper.
Flypaper.
I think on balance it looks very much like the happy medium between the two. Without having really proper evidence, I would suggest that we probably have some ancient lineages here. The wrens might be among them.
What about the tuatara?
Yeah, tuatara.
It's not a bird.
We simply don't have data for it, but that's another candidate.
It seems like the obvious thing that's like everybody talks about it as the living dinosaur, right?
You can't test it for the tuatara unless you find ancient fossils because there's nothing that is closely related to it anywhere else.
Right.
So therefore you can't figure out when it has a close relative in another place.
Right.
It's 225 million years back to everything else, which is, of course, not just Gondwana, that's Pangaea, that's, the entire Earth being connected.
Yeah.
So why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't it be a bit of both? It's just we don't know.
I think it is. I
think in ecology, everything's always a bit of both. I think it's just that. I think it's just science, which like every sort of form of, it has its own kind of clickbait
Yeah.
The journal, Science and Nature, no one's seeing me making air quotes here when I say the journal, Science and Nature, they are very kind of driven by, again, in my humble opinion, by things that grab people's attention. So it's not entirely clickbait, but it's much more, readable if people take a strong dichotomy and a polemic position. And I suspect that that's where Moa's Ark and the flypaper both are. Saying the Noah's Ark, isn't entirely the whole picture, doesn't sound as striking as saying, yeah, it's not that at all, it's definitely the flypaper. That's just my humble opinion of it. I don't know. Michael?
No, I agree. It is, there are some good candidates for having been here for a long time. It's very difficult to prove that it's longer than 80 million years or less. We're talking about things that, dating things that you can perhaps only date molecularly, and there's a lot of error involved in these dates.
So there is basically those two ways, isn't there? There's fossils.
There's fossils, yeah.
And there's molecular data.
Yeah.
And those are the two systems that we use to say something's age when it was here, at least not when it first got here, but at least if there's a fossil of it, and we can date that fossil, it was here at that point.
Yeah.
And it may have been here before that, but
yes, very much
didn't
so.
arrive after that.
Yeah.
I mean, it might have kept arriving, I guess.
Yeah.
So a layperson question, how do we test molecular stuff?
Yeah, so where's the molecular? So then go through the molecular.
Yeah, so the molecular side of things is basically looking at how genetically distant different species are. So let's say...
Michael's tapping out the age signs on the table here.
I'm starting to articulate with my hands, and that's probably not very useful on radio.
No, it's fine. It's fine. We all do it.
So, so let's say you have a takahe and a pukeko. They both have genomes, and those genomes differ in some places. Say there is, 10,000 mutations between them. That's completely wrong now, but let's say there's 10,000 mutations between them. And these mutations arise as soon as two species separate. So they have a common ancestor and they separate. And they arise at relatively regular times. So you can say you get one mutation per million year or something like that.
So the whole of molecular ecology dating is based on the assumption that the mutations happen at a relatively similar and stable time frequency.
Yeah.
So it's kind of archaeology of ecology in some ways.
People have called it the molecular, like they call it molecular archaeology or something similar to that. Yeah. Sorry, Kara, I interrupted there.
Yeah, no, I think that basically summarizes. So you're counting the mutations and then knowing how quickly they arise. You say, well, we have so many mutations. That means that's so many years.
Right.
And there is some variation. So we now have models that assume that mutations actually arise at different rates, and we can model that as well. But with every model comes additional parameters, and addition means additional error. So, yeah.
But models tend to have error bars around them.
Yes.
Good models, I should say, tend to have error bars. And I'm sure that you're in that category of those
course.
doing the good models. So do different taxa have different rates of mutation? And then I imagine that there's some sort of genetic kind of whatever the environment they're in, maybe species that are on an island have different rates compared to those that are on a continent, or whether there's a small population to start with or a large population that might affect the mutation rate.
There's that. And for birds, it's already been demonstrated quite well that the body size, in fact, has something to do with it. So bigger birds slower than smaller birds, which probably has something to do with generation time.
Yeah, because years, so obviously faster generation time, they have just have more opportunity to have mutations, right? Because they're going through the whole cycle faster. And then body size is related in some way to that as well. So there's a whole lot of covariables there, and everything's always confounded because it's ecology at the end of the day.
True.
If it was something simple like physics, then it would be a whole different story. But it's
so can you track the mutations or to some event like?
So
is there a cause and effect, or is that a whole other study?
So, good question, and one that isn't easy to answer, because this is exactly what a lot of the functional genomic is trying to do, right? So you're trying to identify mutations that result from adaptations. which may result from something having
Something
arrived in a
happened.
specific place, right?
Yeah.
Making those connections is very challenging and easy to be controversial.
True.
Because
True.
those bits, you have to know what part of the genome is coding for what thing,
Exactly.
right? And that's not particularly well known in humans, which are right up there along with the fruit fly
Yeah.
and mice with the most studied,
Yeah.
and the little plant as well, Arabidopsis,
Yes.
with the most studied genomes. But I imagine for some, wacky New Zealand bird, then it's probably not that well known. But then the mutation, there's two types of mutations, isn't there? There's sort of random mutations, which I think, are you looking at a different part of the genome for that? Or are you just looking at mutations across the entire genome?
Yeah, so really to make any statement, you will have to look for mutations across the entire genome. I'll give an example of how you can do that with something that isn't a mouse or a human,
Okay.
where you don't have millions of samples or genomes you can work with. Say something that we're working on, Haast's eagle, like the
Right.
giant eagle. Okay,
Right.
It's extinct. We've tested a lot of fossils, and we found one bone that is well enough preserved to actually sequence a genome from. So you're not going to have a huge sample size.
Right,
there.
so you've only got one bone
So you have
from
one bone
bird,
from one bird.
To
and
tell
that's
a
the
whole
only bird
species
that you've
story.
got any DNA.
Well, we have DNA from more. We have DNA from about 10 or 15 of them, but they're
Right.
not so well preserved that you could get an entire genome out of it.
Right,
You get smaller
okay.
fragments, here and there.
Little bits.
But the whole story,
Yeah.
we have one bird.
Wow.
So far
And did you
found.
do that?
Yeah, it's currently still on being
Wow.
sequenced
How
regularly.
excited were you when you got the whole genome out of this one bird?
Well, we have what is called one-fold coverage, which means theoretically we've sequenced the whole genome once, but the data quality is abysmal when you only have one read for
Right,
everything.
yeah.
So there's still a lot missing before we can actually make a statement on anything.
Right.
But I'm using it as an example
Right, okay,
to
carry on.
look
I'll
at
stop
the,
interrupting you, carry
the mutation thingy.
I'm getting
right?
kicked under the table here. So carry on.
So essentially you have so say you want to know what made this bird so big. So we know the ancestor of Haast's eagle probably came over around 2 million years ago from Australia
Right.
and was very likely a very small bird
How do we know that?
because all the close relatives are small. So,
How do we know it
No,
came from Australia?
Yeah.
sorry, the closest relative currently is in Australia.
How do
little
we know
eagle.
that though?
A genetic analysis. So you look at basically a family tree. You sequence the Haast's eagle and the little eagle and the booted eagle and the golden eagle and every other eagle you can get your fingers on.
Right.
And then you see who is the most close related among them. You build a
Right.
family tree.
How do we know that the Australian eagles didn't come from New Zealand?
That is a very good question, and you can't definitively say. It's just on balance, on likelihood. It seems more likely that the birds followed the westerly winds to New Zealand than the other way around. Especially also because there are more eagles in Australia.
Right.
I'm struggling.
So
how
there's
to
more
explain this
eagles in
logically.
Australia, so then we think that.
So we have
But it
absolutely
could be
no,
like that. There's
yeah.
the oldest eagle was in
in New
was
Zealand.
in New Zealand.
We have
and
absolutely
then
no
it-
evidence of eagles being in New Zealand prior to Haast's eagle, as far as I know, or anything related.
Okay, so
But
when's
then
the
I'm not a
oldest?
fossil thief.
When's the oldest evidence we have?
The oldest Haast's eagle fossils are several thousand years old.
Okay.
But genetically, they diverged from the Australian little eagle about 2 million years ago.
Okay.
So somewhere in between there. So the fossils won't tell you much. Or
Right.
I'll be kicked for saying fossils because strictly speaking, it's subfossil remains. So
Okay.
they're not fossilized. They're not stones.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because they're not
So,
quite that old
yeah.
enough. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So-
these are several
to clear that up, good to
thousand-year-old
clear that.
bones.
And they're generally found in caves and
Yes.
things. Yeah.
The best preserved ones will be from alpine caves. That's
Right.
about the best places you have in New Zealand to find well-preserved bones.
Yeah.
And yeah, so there and yeah, but as I'm making this I'm assuming something here.
Okay.
And I can't categorically state it because there is no I can't exclude the possibility that the eagles came from New Zealand first.
Right.
Yeah.
But currently, most of the indications are they
The
came
assumption,
from
So the assumption is they came from Australia.
Australia.
Okay. Is there evidence in Australia of the eagles that are there being there?
I don't know how far back the
Far
evidence
back,
there
further
goes.
back
Yeah,
than
I
the-
don't
the
know
Haast's
how
eagle.
far back that evidence goes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. In any case, what you have is a very big eagle in
Yep.
New Zealand, and then two close relatives, one in Australia, the little eagle, and then the booted eagle, Australasia, also not much bigger. They're both about a meter wingspan.
Right. And Haast's eagle is, what are we talking about here? It's huge. What's
up
that?
to 3 meters. The paleontologists will argue maybe more than 2.50 meters, but with very wide wings. But somewhere in that range. They were up to 15 kg heavy when the little eagle is probably about 1 kg. So it's a 15 times size increase.
Big difference there. Yeah.
And so what drove this evolution? What are the mutations behind that? I don't have a population to study, but what I can do is, because I have these close relatives, the little eagle and the booted eagle, I can look at where they are the same in the genome, but the Haast eagle is different.
Right.
Because chances are that will then be something that has evolved on that Haast eagle lineage.
Right.
If little eagle and booted eagle, and perhaps even golden eagle, which is the next one out.
Next one
out.
So it's like a second cousin.
Yeah, if they're all three the same and Haast eagle is different, then that's very likely something that has evolved in Haast eagle.
Yeah.
And then I can look at those mutations, and most of them will be neutral and not do anything.
So neutral means they're not adaptive,
no effect,
they're just a random mutation,
they're just random, they don't do anything.
They
might not change anything to the function of the body in any possible way. They're just neutral. And most of mutations fall into that category.
Are those ones, is there a high likelihood that a large proportion of those are just ones that we haven't yet figured out what they do?
Some
or do we
of them.
think that they really are just random mutations that the genome doesn't really care about, and so it just kind of flicks on and mutations aren't selected out either, so they just kind of stay there as background?
All of the above. So so there are. First, we need to distinguish between regions of the genome that we do understand and those that we don't understand.
Right. Okay.
We have a bit of an idea of what a lot of the genes do.
Right.
So these are bits of the genome that make proteins, and proteins run your body. So we know a bit about them, and we know a bit about what mutations in those genes do.
Right.
But then there are other places in the genome that we have absolutely no idea what they're doing.
Right.
And so if you have a mutation there, you just don't know what it does.
Just don't know.
Yeah. And even you don't even know all the mutations in genes, because we're not talking about a human or a mouse. It's an eagle from 1,000 years ago. So it's not that easy. But but essentially you're first starting to filter by looking at where is that Haast eagle different from all those close relatives.
Yeah.
And then you look at where those mutations do something to
that
the
we
body.
Change something.
Change something in the body.
And I guess one of the first things that is an obvious thing is stuff that makes you grow bigger.
Yeah.
That's kind of a...
Yeah, so you would assume that probably some things that have happened will be just genes getting duplicated.
Yeah.
So, if you want to be bigger, you just want to have more of a certain protein.
Right.
And to get more of that, well, what do? You just double that region that says make that protein, and have two
regions. It
regions.
gets hit twice as much.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's crazy. That's so simple.
Yeah,
and there must be something that triggers that need, or is it just
well, that's ecology. They arrive here. They're predators. The smaller birds, the smaller prey birds, are accounted for by things like owls and falcons and harriers. But the larger ones aren't. So the bigger you are, the more you can attack that bigger prey. That gives you a certain advantage, because that's not so much hunted by other birds. And so there is your trigger for your selective pressure for generation after generation, the bigger birds reproducing better. And then you end up with this massive bird.
And it's quite a common phenomenon on islands, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it even has a name, doesn't it? Island gigantism.
Yes, this island gigantism and island dwarfism.
Yeah.
Because it goes in both ways.
It goes in both ways. Yeah. So things get little, like those little elephants.
Exactly.
And like there's a hominoid as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
The Hobbit one.
The Hobbit from Flores.
Yeah. I think it's not called the Hobbit one. What is it called? Homo floresiensis.
Floresiensis, yeah.
I'll say it properly.
Homo floresiensis.
Floresiensis, yes.
Yeah.
Germans are very good at pronouncing Latin names. Kiwis not so much. I'm always having trouble with that, my own with my own little German.
Bring back Latin in schools. Is that what you're saying, Barbara?
No, it's just it's a weird thing just about the way we say vowels, and it's the English fault. It's British went on a circuitous route, English did, and German kind of just went straight ahead. Not that I'm saying that Germans are overly direct as a stereotype.
No, I'm not feeling stereotyped at all.
No, no, that's very interesting. So the Haas eagle probably got bigger because it got here and there wasn't a bigger prey.
So it can
there was bigger prey that wasn't accounted for. Basically, there was a lot of big steaks running around that nobody ate.
Yeah, and there wasn't a predator that was bigger.
Exactly.
So there wasn't anything to kind of selectively make it want to be smaller, and there was a lot of bird steak in the form of moa running around.
Yeah.
So, the bigger ones bred with bigger ones, and the whole population got bigger.
Yeah.
And it that must have happened quite quickly though,
It
right?
must have, yeah. If they arrived 2 million years ago, we have no evidence of that, like no fossil evidence of those smaller eagles that preceded, like the growing phase, if you like.
Right,
You know, because
yeah.
all the Haas eagle we have is huge.
the big one.
Yeah. So do we have? So you were saying there's like several fossils or sub-fossils that we've got. Are they all from about the same time zone?
No, they'll be hugely different, but they will all be, or not all. So a lot of them are not dated yet, and my colleagues at the museums at Te Papa and at Canterbury Museum will curse me for saying something wrong here. But from memory, I think most of the ones that are dated will be after the Ice Age, so it will be younger than 10,000 years.
Right.
But again, that there's just a lack of extensive fossils from 2 million years ago.
And we've got the 2 million years because that's the common ancestor with the Australian close relatives there, right?
Yeah.
But
So
and it's interesting, eh? And there is, I think from memory, a Haas eagle in the Otago Museum.
There is,
Hura.
yes, there is.
An articulated one, so you can
Yeah.
go and see that. But that's not the one that you got the DNA from.
No, that particular one I didn't want to drill into because it looked so nice.
Fair enough. I mean, it's always a thing, isn't it? Because most of these rare fossil bones are in museums, and of course they're there as a collection and they're being preserved. So then there's all sorts of caveats on what you can and can't do, because getting a sample is actually, like, you try and obviously be as careful as possible, but it is a destructive process, right? Because you're squishing it all up and putting it into
it ends up with a hole in it as the usual procedure. There are now ways to do that a bit more gently, but they're also not quite as effective in getting the DNA. So then,
because you need enough DNA to get that whole genome.
Yes.
And how many birds have you done this for in New Zealand, approximately?
I'm aware that of, and again, people will correct me on this, but I'm aware of about 70 individuals having ever been found.
70?
Or 70, so 70 individuals of Haas eagle, or parts of those individuals having been found. Now, this is not entire skeletons.
Right,
but 70, like
different
bits and pieces of probably about 70 birds.
Right.
I've tried extracting DNA from 25 so far.
Right.
And of those 25, there was really only one that had far more DNA than everything else.
And why did that one have so much?
It's a really good question, and I can't answer it. So obviously the preservation conditions would have been optimal, but on paper they were not very different from those of others.
So it was just like...
So where were they found? In common areas, or were they right?
The best ones, so there are some from swamp sites. There are some from alpine caves.
Yeah.
And those are the sites that seem to preserve those remains best.
Because you want either really dry conditions that's going to suck the moisture out, and it's just like preservation, or you want really anaerobic conditions, so that's where your swamp comes in. So super, super wet.
So like the West Coast, Fiordland.
The best sample we had now is from the Nelson region. It's from an alpine cave up. In fact, there's a nice side story to that. That best sample is from Mount Owen, from a cave on Mount Owen, which is where Lord of the Rings, the scene in Moria, was filmed. So this is the Haas eagle from the mines of Moria.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah, no, that's good. Because I think when you come into Wellington Airport with the big eagles there, which are obviously part of the Lord of the Rings thing. It always does remind me of Haas Eagle. And I was like, I'm sure other people think Lord of the Rings when they say that. But
You could actually, pinch, for want of a better word, that image and change it from, no, it's not the Lord of the Rings. This is, the Haas Eagle, New Zealand as it was.
It's quite a lot of birds, just of the Haas Eagle. But what I was really wondering was how many species of birds have been worked on in this way, not just with you, from New Zealand, just.
Okay, so it depends on what you define
as a rough kind of proportion of the.
It depends on how you define have been worked on. Like in terms of genome sequencing, there's been a lot of it is not published. So I'm going to say the entirely wrong number if I say 20 or 25 or something like that. But
it's quite a small number compared to the size of the bird
I should say
fauna.
no. I think we've done 20 alone. So there'll be others. So it's more in the. Okay, I'm just going to put a number out there. It's probably in the space of 35 to 40.
Right.
Very few published. There's going to be a significant chunk when my PhD student, or former PhD student, Dr. Pascal Lübbe, is publishing her data. That will include probably somewhere between 15 and 20 genomes alone. And then, but there's other groups who are doing.
And that's all extinct birds, is
it?
it?
No, this will be. Well, you can't do a lot of extinct birds because it's very expensive. So most of that will be present day birds.
Right.
But some of them are extinct. Yeah.
So you've done some extinct birds.
Yeah.
And some present day birds.
Yeah.
And going back to the Moa's Ark and the flycatcher paper, is that the ultimate aim of your work, kind of in general, is just to find out when things got here and when they diverged and whether it was adaptive?
It's broader than that, and I think that's when I'm talking about individual species, that gets a bit lost, the big picture in that whole story. What we're interested in general is basically how did the birds get here and when?
Yeah.
What happened when they were here? So how did the environment influence them? And also, can we simulate how they will be affected by climate change in the future? These are very different questions.
But all kind of related.
They're all kind of related, right? Because it's one story.
One leads on to the next one.
It's understanding basically the origins and the evolution and the future of the New Zealand bird fauna.
Yeah, and if you can, I guess, see how things changed to a new environment when they got here.
That is one of the main drivers. So the story with the flypaper and all this. So this is us trying to figure out which bird species arrived here, when and why.
Right.
And you get a general picture of, which is not surprising in any possible way. You have the forest birds, the endemic forest birds, which would have been here longest because New Zealand was a densely forested environment, so there's nothing surprising about that. You then have a wave of open habitat species coming in as soon as the ice ages start, because they would have wiped out some forest, created open habitat that the New Zealand birds were not adapted to. So that's when the Aussies come in and take over.
Right. So they're just really they might have been landing on New Zealand prior to that. They just never really managed to establish because there wasn't any habitat that was suitable for them.
There was always
and then once the open habitat got there from the Ice Age, which is just an environmental change, and that would have happened, I guess, gradually over a number of centuries or years or whatever, quite a long time. And then over that time, the ones from Australia that just had just sort of a bit of a gradual rain of species and individuals dropping onto New Zealand, and they were just dying because they hit forest and they were an open ground species. And then there was enough of them not dying that they were able to breed and establish a little colony here.
As soon as the habitat was there and the competition wasn't there, because of course New Zealand forest birds wouldn't compete well in the open habitat.
So they probably were doing actually better in New Zealand than they may have been in Australia because they've left behind a whole lot of predators and competition. Trudy would like to say something, I think.
I'm just thinking, not wanting to be cliche, but are we saying Australians are opportunists? It's an opening. Let's go for it.
My colleague Nick Rawlins called it the great Australification of New Zealand.
I don't like this. So we've got to hang on to our...
And the worrying thing is that this didn't just happen 2.5 million years ago. It is actually happening right now as we speak, as a result of things that we are doing.
Yeah.
So, over the last 10,000 years, we're in this interglacial. So, we have forestation taking off again until people arrived about 800 years ago or so, or 700, and slowly forests get taken out.
So this is the first wave of humans in New Zealand is the Polynesian.
Yeah, so we have already starting
immigration.
deforestation then, and then of course Europeans come in and expand that significantly. But the result is, again, more open habitat.
Yeah.
And also wiping out some of the birds that have been adapted to the environment so far, right? So we're opening niches again.
Right.
And so now we have all these Australian birds coming in again right now, not just 2.5 million years ago. So, and these are birds that we think of as New Zealand, like pukeko.
Yeah.
That hasn't been here more than 600 years or so.
Oh, really?
The
Is it
swamp
actually?
harrier. Swamp harrier is an Aussie. It doesn't actually do particularly
Like
well in
kahu.
Australia. It's a very specific swamp harrier thing.
Right.
In New
Okay.
Zealand, the harrier hawk it's called sometimes,
Yeah.
you can find it everywhere.
Kahu.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then
What about the little New Zealand karerea? The little New Zealand falcon?
That is New Zealand.
That is New Zealand?
Yeah.
So could that be a really old species?
We've dated it as well, but I don't have the number in my head right now.
But we're thinking that that's more likely Moa's Ark than flycatcher.
No, it could be one of the 2 million year ones, but I'm not entirely sure right now.
What
I don't
happened
have
at 2
data.
million years ago?
That's the opening up of habitat through the ice
Oh,
ages.
that's the Ice Age, of course. Yeah, sorry.
So that
Goodness me.
I don't know the numbers for that
Getting
particular
eye
one.
rolls here.
But yeah, so that's that story.
Yeah.
And then they come here. And then, of course, we have this adaptation story, eagle becoming really big. And that's very interesting from a completely different perspective because it tells us something about evolution. So we're worried about how species might respond to rapid climate change. We're saying, well, this is unprecedented and all. But you need to think about this. The species that arrived here and established here, they had instantaneous environmental change.
That's
Came
true.
from Australia to New Zealand.
That's
So
true.
there would be instantaneous pressure,
To
selective
do
pressure.
something. Yeah.
So if we
Although
can
it's
understand...
It's slightly different. Sorry, just going back to that. It is slightly different because they've got a massive propagal pressure, haven't they? Because they've got a lot of individuals in Australia that are raining down instantaneously into a new habitat in New Zealand, but still there's a large number
Is it
from
a
the
large
source
number?
population.
That's the question. Is it a large number?
Well, it's a continuous rain, isn't it? So you just wait until you get one that's got the right
Yeah.
genes, like
That-
it's slightly
yeah.
big enough to survive here. Whereas if you're going extinct from an environmental change over decades or 100 years, then maybe having a very poor population to start with, the one that's been squished into a really bad environment for that species to start with. Like the takahi, they're not actually a mountain species, but they got this little refuge up in the mountains there, so which isn't their ideal habitat within New Zealand.
Yeah,
So
no, they're an
it's
open
not a
habitat species, and the only open habitat they have now where they're not interfered with by people is, the mountains.
So it's kind of like, it is an analogy, but it's not a perfect one, which obviously you didn't mean.
If there's a gene that says I need to be bigger because I can be bigger, then if you're under threat of extinction because the environment changes, you come to a new environment, is there not a gene that says I must reproduce quickly as well to build on those bits that I need to survive here?
It's all a balance, though.
This is the selection thing, though, right?
Yeah.
Because
Oh,
this
yeah,
is not
you're right.
that the animals don't come in with a master plan. It's all try and error. So, there's a whole set of different genes, and it just happens that whichever gene is best adapted to that environment at that time
survives.
gets
Yeah.
selected
Yeah.
for. So
But then I would think if I was that gene, I'd say, okay, so this is what we need to live here. Then I'm going to make sure that whatever it is, how we reproduce, that needs to speed up to make sure we're surviving.
So I've tried to explain things like that. I've been asked things like that in an exam when I was studying, and I argued in a similar way. And the professor called me a Lamarckist because, there's, of course, Lamarckian evolution is basically what that says. Determine that animals are basically determined to do.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really just you don't die.
Yeah.
Whatever makes your success slightly better is the thing that
And you
gets
have more kids.
passed on. And you have to reproduce.
Yeah, exactly.
If
So
you're not
I'd be
reproducing,
saying,
you have no input into the next generation.
I've got this vision of rampant birds all around the country having a great time. We've got to get this on, or else we'll be extinct.
No, well, there is also kin selection there. Okay, so you can have a sort of an influence on the next generation by ensuring that your close kin have a better chance of survival and reproduction. So I mean, that's why we have grandmothers, right? That's why we don't die straight away. I don't know what the reasoning for having grandfathers is. I've only ever heard of it as the grandmother.
Happy, I suppose. I don't know.
The grandmother hypothesis. Sorry, I'm diverging here into crazy talk.
Right, now that we're dissing all grandfathers. Right. Okay.
Just in case my father listens to this show. Sorry, Dad.
Yeah. So well, that's one angle to look at it. And then, of course, we're interested with the birds that are here. Can we model how they're going to respond to climate change?
Right.
And this is, again, work that Pascal Lübbe did. She basically got hold of simulations where she combined molecular data, which gives you some idea of how populations have changed over time.
Right.
And she correlated that with environment data.
Right.
And so basically you should say, okay, well, here's less habitat, and you can see that the population size goes down. That's great. And then you see increase in habitat goes up. So she then took that data from the past, which seemed to fit, and extrapolated it into the future, assuming that if it fit in the past, then, the future will also work. And that gives us some idea of how different bird species will do when it gets warmer, where their habitat will be, whether their population sizes will increase, decrease.
But also not just warmer, of course.
Oh,
also
no, just,
wetter or
wetter.
drier.
So this is
depending
taking into
on
account.
so it's depending on where you are in the country, right? So some places it will get more snow, some places it will get wetter, some places it will get drier, some places it will get drier and wetter on a sort of interannual cycle, and some places it will just get more stable.
I'm doing a data injustice. There's I don't know how many parameters are in that environmental simulation that all get counted.
Sorry, I'm giving
basically.
Michael a hard time here.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And I was misrepresenting the effort and data that goes into that. And it does give you an idea, and not surprisingly for a lot of native species, it'll go down.
Is there increased fire in your environment? Because I wonder,
that's a good question.
That must impact quite a lot into bird species.
I'm going to
because
get
the
told
current
off.
climate simulations do have increased fire as one of the biggest drivers.
Yeah,
like especially on that dry eastern.
So this is using some of the
side.
up-to-date climate simulations. I'm just not sure if fire is in there. I'm going to get told off for not knowing that. But I'm not entirely sure on this. But the basic picture is a lot of native species will struggle because the habitat is affected, unless, and as Pascal put it, if it gets warmer, the best thing you can do is be a shell duck. Because they seem to be, in their simulations, they seem to be doing no matter what.
Shell duck, right.
Yeah.
Sorry. Shell duck.
Yeah, a paradise shell duck.
So we call them paradise ducks, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Shell ducks, yeah.
Yeah, be a paradise duck.
So paradise ducks, are they native? Are they Australianification? What's their class?
Yeah, I need the data. You're putting me on the spot, and
I'm terrible like that, aren't I?
It's terrible. It's indeed. I should have read all of Pascal's thesis before I came here, because that's where all this information comes from. But yes.
Yeah. So we've got. I mean, I guess it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we've also got all the introduced species that have just been brought into New Zealand on purpose because British people missed having whatever in their garden. And I imagine that they tried to bring in all the garden species, robins and everything, and they had more luck bringing in seed-eating species than insect-eating species, simply because they were easier to keep alive on the boat over here.
Probably. I haven't looked into those deliberately introduced species at all, if I'm honest.
Because I just wonder, because they're like it's a recent, more recent introduction.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you can sort of see those processes more actively happening. Yes, and there's people looking at that too. And of course it is, and this is a different time scale again. So in evolutionary terms, these will be birds that have been exposed to New Zealand environment for at most 150 years. One was the Naturalization Society when it started around thereabouts. Big push in the 1840s, 1860s, really. So thereabouts, which is a very different time scale. So you can look at, in the genome space, you can look at sort of really fast response sort of things, not so much the longer term evolutionary patterns. But again, this is very interesting as well. And there are researchers in New Zealand that look at these patterns. Yeah. It's just not us at the moment. Right. Yeah. No. I just was thinking, because it's another big influx of species, and I guess there's that minor bird. I don't know where it comes from, South Africa or something, doesn't it? Asia? Is it? Asia, maybe. Oh, I know it's an Indian minor bird. Yeah. No, it's Asian. Yeah. Don't know what I'm thinking about. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, those are definitely interesting. But yeah, we've focused on the natives. So you're focusing on native species and species that have recently come across from Australia. Self-introduced. And the extinct species as well. Yeah. Yeah. With extinct species, there's always the question of why did they go extinct? Yeah. So that's another question and that's probably where we started from. It's just evolved into more of. Are there many? So there's a big extinction kind of event after the first Polynesians come to New Zealand, and that's probably largely driven also by the environment change that happened then. And then a second big wave of extinctions after Europeans came, and that big deforestation that happened then. So first years we always say about 30% of the country was deforested in the first wave of humans, and then the second wave came with metal saws and axes and took out another 30%, and now we've got just under 30% of the original forest left in New Zealand. Was there much extinction of birds before that Polynesian wave?
Not in any pronounced way that I'm aware of. So these waves of extinction were really quite predominant or very distinct from everything else that happened before.
Right.
And we have looked into patterns there as well, and that's also an interesting story, which we probably don't have time, but it's essentially in every habitat other than forests, and this is statistics, right? Otherwise it doesn't work. So statistically, it's the big birds that go first, because it makes sense. That's what people would have hunted. You get more out of a big bird.
And also the predators, the big predators need more prey to eat, right? So they're the ones who go extinct first because they run out of food.
Yeah.
If we eat all the big birds.
And in the forest, it seems to be, well, first the forest lag behind a bit, and then you see the small birds disappear in that second wave of extinction when European predators come in.
Right.
So they seem to have been more affected by these introduced mammalian predators than they were by hunting. But again, that makes sense.
Because ironically, the bigger birds would have been more able to cope with the introduced predators.
Yeah.
But, I mean, a mouse or a rat doesn't do much to a massive Haas seagull, right? But the Haas seagull, unfortunately, was already extinct.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really sad. Yeah.
Yes.
And then I guess we're in our third zone of extinctions now, which is just the start of the climate change extinctions.
Yes. Do we see do we see a lot of that happening right now? So we have species that are on the brink of extinction.
Yeah.
Kaki, kakapo, takahe, all of them only survive because of massive conservation efforts.
Yeah.
But for those, I think it's still that second wave human influence that we're seeing here, rather than a climate influence.
Right.
So, yeah, I
guess it gets quite tricky to pull those two strands
it does.
apart,
Because climate change.
Because climate change is pushing down. It's another fact, right? So where they might, I mean, the kakapo, for instance, they're doing fantastically well. Their numbers, fantastically well in terms of a species that was thought to be extinct for 60 years. So their numbers are going up and up every year, but then there's also all those things that are pushing against it, which is, of course, climate change.
There's a really good study that looks at this.
Human activity. So
I was sort of thinking of climate change as more like a global human influence on it rather than a direct human influence. But even the direct human influence was also through.
There is that a really good study on thermal squeeze, where basically alpine birds get influenced by climate warming and come more into range of mammalian predators. And so it... I'm not very familiar with the theory, so I don't even want to go into it before I...
No, and of course we do actually only have a couple of minutes left.
Yeah.
So I will let you say, what is the thing that we haven't asked you about that you would like to say right at the end here?
I have a feeling we've talked about most of the things, especially those that could be covered in 1 minute and 30 we've got left. So
I've put you on the spot yet again.
God, this is terrible,
isn't it?
Yeah.
No.
Keep doing that.
I guess if someone wanted to be a molecular ecologist, if someone thought, listening to this out there and they're thinking, this is an amazing job, that's what I want to do. I really want to study New Zealand birds and how they got here and what's going to happen, and especially what's going to happen with climate change. What route would they take to get to there?
Basically, study anything from zoology, ecology, genetics, anything in that space.
Botany.
Well, if you're interested in birds, botany is not going to help you that much.
Well, I mean, it's talking as someone who did a PhD in botany,
that is
right?
true. I'm just not sure if I'm the perfect example of how to get into this. I've taken a very long-winded route to get where I am.
I mean, I guess the thing is also is that even though you're studying birds, similar processes happened with insects and
Yes,
plants
exactly.
and, I mean, everything that you can imagine, fungi, everything sort of was the same.
For me, it is really, look into the ecology and the big picture, and don't specialize too much or don't think about just one system.
Yeah.
And
the ecology is the best, eh? It's the broad
Exactly.
picture of everything, why everything happens and all the interactions between everything and
No,
everyone.
I need to put in a plug.
and the
Biological
world.
anthropology is the best.
Hey, thank you
yeah.
so much for joining us here today, Michael. And we have a little koha from Estelle Florists on the corner
thank you very much.
there. And they very nicely gave us these beautiful orchids for you to take home, knowing that really your true heart lies with plants.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.